Alright, so you might know that a couple of days ago I posted an S10 Plus versus iPhone XS Max versus Mate 20 Pro camera comparison, and basically YouTube completely screwed up the processing on it, which was upsetting because I kind of spent nearly 2 sleepless nights putting that video together. But we're out here in Barcelona right now, and I've used it as an opportunity to take this test up a notch. Yeah, that is how the Mate 20 Pro's microphone sounds, sadly. Now, the first thing we're going to test is front cameras, and to do this, overkill I know, but we got a speedboat. And to clarify one thing, this boat was going fast, and so with this in mind, I'd say all 3 phones have done a pretty good job at stabilizing the video, a fair bit better than I was stabilizing myself at this point. You'll notice that the S10 Plus has a wide-angle front camera. It's not massively wide, but it does fit in a noticeable amount more in this shot. One other thing worth taking note of is the fact that Samsung's latest shoots in 4K on the front camera, a massive leap above 1080p on the other phones. Also, as you can see here, all 3 do a pretty good job at handling really harsh background lighting, which is about as tough a scenario as it gets. So yeah, when it comes to front camera, the S10 Plus is a mile ahead in terms of resolution, but when it comes to colors and actually stabilization, the iPhone XS Max is a little more balanced. Now, Samsung is super proud of the dual cameras they've got on the front of the S10 Plus. In fact, to quote their website, they call it the front camera that outperforms other rear cameras. Bold claim, but I'm happy to tell you they are not far off with that. It's got the rich colors of the iPhone, but also manages to produce a crisper image. I've shown these photos to quite a few people, and some do prefer the iPhone. It is what I'd say a more realistic portrayal of the actual colors, but at the same time, the skin tones are brighter on the Samsung, and this produces, to a lot of people, a more visually pleasing image. And because you've got 2 cameras, you've got 2 different focal lengths, so you can actually take a slightly wider angle selfie. It really comes into its own though when you start taking portrait mode selfies, or live focus as Samsung likes to call it. I would say the iPhone does things pretty well considering that it's only using 1 camera, but Huawei is definitely on the weaker end here. It prefers to overexpose to beautify the face, but in a lot of cases this actually results in loss of detail. The S10's edge detection could be better. In fact, as you can see here, it's messed up my jacket a little bit, but at the same time it's a marked improvement. There's quite a consistent trend here. The Mate 20 Pro consistently overexposes, almost on purpose. The iPhone XS Max is pretty well exposed, and the S10 Plus I'd say is generally slightly overexposed on all the shots, but not enough to look blown out like the Huawei. Samsung also has a few new ways that you can manipulate the background in your selfies. Probably not something I'll use very much, but nonetheless well executed. Alright, we are about to take this test up a notch. So yeah, one of the other ways we're going to test the phone is with a copter, and I'll show you footage from it in a bit, but this was a pretty good opportunity to capture some slow motion. All 3 can shoot continuous 240 frames per second slow-mo, but the S10 and the XS Max have a big advantage in that they can do this at 1080p versus 720 on the Huawei. Whilst I would say the iPhone's slow motion is the cleanest looking, it misses out on super slow-mo or 960 FPS, which the other 2 can do. Both the S10 and the iPhone can shoot 4K video at 60 FPS, but for some reason Huawei has capped their phone at 4K 30, and this frame shows you just how differently each one processes color. The frames look completely different even though it's the same scene. Even though the Huawei Mate 20 Pro actually has generally very good dynamic range, here it is up against the 2 best, and it shows because those phones just handle it better. If you have a look at the Huawei footage, especially just above those buildings, you can see that it's overexposed, and it feels like the company tries to compensate for this by just adding loads of saturation. When you're standing still though, Huawei's stabilization completely kills it. They use what they're calling AI stabilization, and whether that's actually the case, it looks almost like it's on a tripod. But when you start moving, especially at 4K, and especially compared to these 2 phones, you can tell it loses its polish a little bit, and I can't help but feel like the color, whilst it's vibrant and saturated, is too much. When we move to 1080p though, Samsung has a bit of an ace up its sleeve. They call it super steady video, and essentially it uses the extra ultra-wide camera that this phone now has for computational video. So because the ultra-wide can be aware of what is happening outside of just what the main camera sees, it can almost calculate and preempt how the stabilization needs to counteract this. It works really well. It is a marked improvement over the Note 9, but it does still do a little bit of drifting. Compared to the iPhone in this scene, which stays pretty constant when looking at those buildings, Samsung kind of shifts from being super steady to then drifting and then becoming super steady again. Now, you might know by now that the S10 Plus and the Mate 20 Pro both have ultra-wide lenses, and you can film video with this. But the only thing worth bearing in mind is that the quality is noticeably less good, and in fact the quality degradation is much more noticeable in video than it is with photo, so even without zooming in you can still see grain, especially on the Mate 20 Pro. So before we get to photos and night mode, the last thing we need to test in video is autofocus capability, and I gotta say the Samsung didn't blow me away here. Compared to the iPhone and the Mate 20 Pro, which have quite a smooth transition between the foreground and the background as we change, the S10's is a little jerky. It takes a little second to figure out what it needs to focus on. And I've tried this in an indoor environment, especially when it's less well lit, and the problem is intensified. It doesn't seem to pick up close objects very well, and even when it does, oftentimes it's a little temperamental with them and it'll sometimes resort to just focusing on the background again. Also, final reminder that I'm giving away 5 S10 phones with everything Apple Pro. All the rules are in the description below. When we start looking at photos, one thing to bear in mind is that hardware-wise, the S10 Plus camera is very similar to the Note 9 last year, and the main improvement comes from its software. I was initially pretty disappointed with this. I was hoping that the S10 would have a big sensor upgrade, but actually this software tuning has made quite a bit of difference. AI scene detection has been beefed up, and colors are vibrant, appropriately sharpened, and even with harsh backlighting, foregrounds remain well exposed. I'd still say though that the iPhone has the best, most consistent high dynamic range between photos and videos. Admittedly, it makes the shadows a little brighter than I would like, but at the same time, it is the absolute best at controlling bright areas. The Mate 20 Pro also shoots really great photos with a really fast shutter time, but I would say, and you can probably tell here, the colors are slightly on the warm side. If you take a closer look at your screen right now, at the hotel in the background, that kind of curved dome shape, you'll be able to tell that on the Huawei, the whole texture has disappeared into the light. Samsung's scene detection doesn't always pick up the scene that you're looking for, but when it does, more often than not, you tend to get a better photo because of it, like this one. I remember when I took this photo, I could see that it was picking up that there were buildings as the focus, and it automatically sharpened the lines and increased the contrast in only the areas where it was needed. Portrait mode on all 3 phones will probably make most people happy, but on balance the iPhone definitely takes the most consistent shots. It again controls the really bright areas and exposes the skin and the body in a way that seems more natural. And you can tell in this photo that it does a good job of distinguishing subjects that are 2 meters behind from subjects that are 40 meters behind. Whereas, I mean, if you look at the Huawei, that pretty much looks like it's just applied a massive blur filter to everything that's not me. That's not to say that Huawei's portrait mode can't be good. In fact, I'd say in this scenario it produced a really cinematic shot straight out of the camera. It's more just the fact that it's got the capability to be quite inconsistent. To test the zoom, I tried seeing how well I could read this sign from a distance, and the Mate 20 Pro's 3x zoom is still unbeaten. That's all there is to really say about it. The Samsung and the iPhone can only zoom in 2x optically, which is standard, it's decent, but you can see for yourself how much difference Huawei's extra zoom makes. I also tried zooming in all the way 10 times, and because of the Huawei's more advanced optical zoom, you can tell it's more comfortable here, but the S10 isn't as far behind as you'd think, and I think the fact that it's got a higher contrast color palette kind of helps to give it the definition that it needs. I'm a big fan of ultra-wide lenses, so it's great to see that both the S10 Plus and the Mate 20 Pro come with one, and while the quality is not as good as the primary lens on both phones, if you're shooting with plenty of light, you don't notice the disparity, and it just adds a really cool perspective. Also, a lesser known fact is that Samsung's ultra-wide is wider. It gives you a 0.5 times magnification as opposed to 0.6 on the Mate 20 Pro. It just means you can fit that little bit more in one frame. Things get a little more interesting in low light. So to address a misconception, the S10 has a bright night mode, but there's a complication. Unlike devices like the Mate 20 Pro, where you can take night mode shots at will, Samsung has tied night mode into part of its scene detection algorithm, and so instead of being able to turn it on when you want, you have to wait for it to decide that it's dark enough. And it's not a deal breaker, it's not the end of the world, but there are a lot of times when you're in medium lighting conditions where you might want to take a night mode shot anyway, because that can help to control the really bright areas or just make a photo look a little sharper. You can't do that on the Samsung, it has to be really, really dark for it to work. Take this shot, taken in a pretty dimly lit hotel corridor. I used night mode on the Mate 20 Pro and that really helped to give some definition to the lights on the floor, whereas on the other two phones, it kinda just looks like a blown out mess. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. Literally, because the S10 Plus has a variable aperture, which means that in low light, it'll open up its aperture to let more light in. And so, although you're taking standard non-night mode photos in the dark, they're actually really good. Colors are realistically represented, and it avoids the problem that some people have with the Huawei, that its night mode brightens the image so much that, in a lot of cases, it stops it actually looking like it's nighttime. Although I don't personally think that's a problem. I think after Pixel's night sight, Huawei has the second best smartphone camera at night mode. If you pay attention to the purple rings around the building here, you'll see that the iPhone is the only one that's managed to control those white areas and stop them being overexposed, but at the same time its images are at the risk of being a little on the soft side. One cool thing that the Samsung lets you do actually is called Starburst mode. It detects the lights that you see at night and adds a little flare onto them. You can see it in this photo, pretty effective. I suppose one of the most important things here is how much detail do you capture at night, and I was really impressed by the S10 Plus here. Just a normal photo on that phone is capturing as much detail as the Mate 20 Pro's night mode. Its photos are a little less smooth because the noise reduction algorithm isn't as powerful on the S10 Plus, but that's not necessarily a disadvantage. And compared to the iPhone, it definitely has the less grainy shots. Okay, in really low light, Samsung's bright night mode comes on. You hold the phone steady for a few seconds and it uses AI to stabilize the shot. Just like Huawei's, but not as good. As the name implies, photos taken with this bright night mode are indeed bright. They weren't kidding around, but the stabilization and therefore the resulting sharpness of these photos is definitely low. It's definitely possible that because the S10 Plus has literally just been announced, we're in early days and we might get an update to this mode soon. I hope so, it kinda needs it. On the subject of things being dark, it's also worth addressing flash quality. Now all three have pretty good flash modules, but you can tell the iPhone XS Max does a better job of readjusting the colors to compensate for that flash. Compared to the greenish looking images on the S10 Plus and the Mate 20 Pro, the iPhone's looks not just more true to life, but also just more aesthetically pleasing. It's kind of how you'd want to present an image. Filming video at night is pretty much the toughest thing you can do on your smartphone camera, and unfortunately the S10 is not ushering in any new next generation technologies to cope with this, but it keeps up, and I would say it's at least as good as the XS Max and the Mate 20 Pro. Just don't use the ultra-wide, it'll suck. Alright guys, this video has been a long time in the making, so if you did enjoy it, it would mean a lot to me if you could smash that subscribe button down below. Giveaway rules are in the description, and as always, my name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.